So let me begin by describing for you probably one of the most pressing problems that we face in the internet today. The hackers of the world are causing great trouble, but they have for many, many centuries. It was the Goths first, and then the Vandals, and then the Huns, and now it's the geeks who are hacking the network. So we shouldn't be too surprised that hacking is still a problem. Perhaps some of you know that a few days ago in Tarragona we actually unveiled a new street called Internet Street. This is another idea that Manuel Sanoma cooked up. But in the course of the discussion with the mayor, we decided we needed another street next to it called Hacker Alley. And so I can imagine that we would have times when we would meet at the corner of Internet Street and Hacker Alley and have a fight. I think it would be helpful, at least I have found it helpful, to understand the power of the information revolution by going back to understand the power of the Industrial Revolution and how much it changed the way we live and work. So I'm going to draw a kind of analogy. Do you remember when the Industrial Revolution first started, the way in which we produced mechanical work was to go find a river and build a water wheel on the river, and then use the mechanical work of the water wheel to drive belts and pulleys to make engines function so we could manufacture things faster. But that limited where we could place our manufacturing facilities. They had to be next to rivers. So the next invention was the steam engine, and that allowed us to move those manufacturing plants to almost anywhere we wanted to put them, as long as we could build a steam plant. So we needed water for that, but we didn't need running water. Then the next invention after that is electrical power generation and electrical motors. This is a major transformation, because now wherever we could send electrical power, we could put an electric motor to do mechanical work. Moreover, that motor could be as large or as small as we wanted. So we could build very large motors, for example, to drive elevators up and down, and very tiny motors to drive, for example, an electric clock. In fact, today, each one of you has many hundreds of motors that are working for you 24 hours a day, and you don't have to pay any attention to that. You have motors in your kitchen appliances. You have motors in your car, electrical motors to start the car. In fact, sorry? Oh yes, and also in your mixer or whatever that thing is. That looks like a very evil weapon. The one thing that you have is in your refrigerator. There is a little motor that is driving a compressor to keep your food cold and to keep your ice cream from melting. Now, most of us don't lie awake at 3 o'clock in the morning worrying that the electricity is going to go out and our ice cream will melt, because we assume that the electrical power system is going to operate most of the time. We assume that of most infrastructure. So we assume the telephone system will work. We assume that the road system will work. And of course, we get very upset when these things don't work, when the power goes out, when the telephone system doesn't work, and when the roads become congested. We are very annoyed because we have come to depend on infrastructure. Internet is becoming an infrastructure. It's something we're beginning to depend on more and more. Now, the analogy I want to draw between the internet and the electrical power system is that instead of electrons going through wires to drive electric motors, the internet moves information through the network, and it delivers the information to computers that are running software. So the computers that are running software are like the electrical motors. And in many cases, we have pieces of software running in those computers 24 hours a day doing work for us when we're doing something else. So just like the electric motors were there to multiply our muscle power. The computers and the software in them and the information that moves through the network is there to multiply our brain power. And it's because of that comparison that I think the information revolution is going to be just as powerful, maybe more powerful, than the industrial revolution that preceded it. Well, let me turn to internet for just a moment. We use the term internet, we say the internet, as if it were one network. But as Amadeo already has mentioned, it is really hundreds of thousands of networks that are connected all around the world. The only reason that you can have that many things working together is that they all use the same set of communication protocols. The first two protocols that were designed were called TCP for Transmission Control Protocol and IP for Internet Protocol. Bob Kahn, my partner Bob Kahn, and I started this design work in 1973. And as Amadeo mentioned, the Internet Protocol is as simple as possible so it can run on any underlying transmission system. When Bob and I started working on this system, we knew that we did not know what new telecommunications technologies would come along in the future. We didn't know about things like SDH and SONET and ADSL. None of those were invented then. But we knew we wanted the design to continue to operate as new communication services were invented. So we started with the simplest possible assumption. We said that all the internet architecture requires is that the underlying communication system take a bag of bits and move them from point A to point B with some probability bigger than 0. That's all we're asking for of the underlying system. And so as a result, that very simple requirement has allowed us to put the Internet Protocol on top of literally every communication system that has been invented in the last 25 years. Well, for those of you who already know the details of how Internet works, let me apologize. But I am assuming that some of you don't have a clear understanding of how the Internet functions. And if we're going to talk about policy today, if we're going to talk about laws, and trying to make laws about the Internet, it's very important for you to have a simple understanding of how the network functions. Otherwise, you might be tempted to make laws that can't be enforced. And I think that's not a good idea, because if you can't enforce a law, you breed contempt for it, and that's not healthy in a society like ours. So let me start out by reminding you about how things are addressed in the network. How do we label them? This is just like telephone numbers, except that in the Internet we use 32 bits of address. That's enough address space so that you could label up to 4 billion devices on the Internet. This slide is talking about the detailed history of the address structure in the network. Just like the telephone numbers have a structure, the Internet addresses have a structure. You don't really need to know all of the history. The important point is that we have had to evolve the way we describe addresses in the Internet because we've had an increasing number of networks to interconnect. When I first started this work so many years ago, I didn't think that we would need more than 128 different networks. That was, at that time, more than the number of countries, I think, in the world, and I didn't think that we would need more than one network per country. And besides, this was an experiment. This was in 1973. This was simply a research program, and the Defense Department was paying for all of the work. They couldn't afford to build very many networks because networks in those days were expensive. So I originally designed this with only room for 128 networks. Well, now we know we need many, many more than that. So today we have enough room for 4 billion devices on the net. If you want to think about a good analogy, Internet packets are like postcards. And everything that you know about a postcard applies to an Internet packet. So here's an example. This Internet packet has a from address, which looks like just some numbers. By the way, these numbers are a way of representing 32 bits of address space. Each one of the numbers has a value ranging from 0 to 255, so that represents 8 bits of information. So if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 times 8 is 32 bits of information in this address. So like a postcard, there's a from address and there's a to address. And then every internet packet says what version of internet protocol it is carrying, and then it has some contents. Clearly this is an oversimplified view, but it's enough for our purposes. So now let's talk a little bit about how the basic internet protocol works. If you think about an internet packet as if it's a postcard, and you imagine that what happens to postcards when you put them into the postal system, the analogy is pretty clear. If you put a postcard into the postal system, there's no guarantee that it will come out. And that's true of an internet packet in the internet. When you put it into the internet, there's no guarantee that it will come out again. So it's what's called a best effort system. If you put 2 postcards into the Postal Service to be delivered to the same destination, it doesn't necessarily, they don't come out in the same order you put them in. This is also true of internet packets. There's no guarantee of sequencing. In fact, the internet does something that the Postal Service doesn't do. Sometimes it will make a copy of an internet packet and deliver 2 of them. So far as I know, the post office doesn't make that a service. I think of internet networks, the networks that make up the internet are kind of like what we call bucket brigades. When you're putting out a fire, before there were fire engines, people would have big buckets full of water and they would hand the buckets full of water to each other. The internet system uses computers that are called routers, and the routers hand buckets of internet packets to each other, and they go down the network one by one until they get from the beginning to the end. So there are really hundreds of thousands of bucket brigades in the internet. Each one of those bucket brigades is a network, and they are all connected together to form this common internet. Well, you would be quite justified in saying that there's no obvious reason why a network like the one I just described would be very useful. Packets are not guaranteed to come out. They don't stay in any particular order. Sometimes they get duplicated. How could you possibly make anything useful out of that? And the answer is that you have to put on top of that very simple internet protocol a layer of procedure to deal with the problem of losing packets and duplicating them or getting them out of order. This notion of layering is pretty important to the internet architecture. There are many layers of procedure in the system. Each one of those layers is typically another protocol. So the second most important protocol in the internet is called TCP. It stands for Transmission Control Protocol, and its job is to fix all of the weaknesses of the underlying postcard-like system. So I'm going to use an analogy to describe how the TCP does its job, and I'll become Manel San Roma. I'm going to send a book to Manel through the internet. Suppose that I was trying to send him a book through the post office, and the only way I could send it is with postcards. So now I'm going to try to figure out how I'm going to create a procedure for sending books through the Postal Service with postcards, and that will be analogous to the way the TCP protocol sends information through the net with internet packets. So the first thing I would do is cut up the pages of the book so that they could fit on the postcards. Then I would notice that not every postcard has a page number because I cut the pages up. And I'm thinking they're not going to stay in order. So how is Manel going to put them back together in the right order? I better put a number, a sequence number, on every single postcard. 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now I've messed up my translator, I bet. Sorry. So now I put a number on each postcard so Manel can put them back in the right order. Otherwise it's hard to read the book. Then I would remember that some of the postcards are going to get lost. So I better keep copies in case I have to send new ones. Then I wonder, how do I know if I should send a copy? Then I have a brilliant idea. I will ask Manel to send me a postcard every once in a while saying I got all of the postcards up to number 306. And that way I know I can discard the copies up to that number because he got them all. Then I remember that the postcard he's supposed to send me might get lost. So in the end, I decide I have to have a kind of timeout that says if I'm hearing nothing from Manel at all, that I had better start sending copies of things that have not yet been acknowledged. And eventually I will hear the postcard from Manel saying I got everything up to 408. Well, that's about all there is to this TCP protocol, except it works on internet packets instead of postcards, and it runs about 100 million times faster than the post office. Which is not saying much, I guess. I guess there's one other thing that's important. If you had a real post box, it would have a finite size. Now, suppose we started with a book that had 1,000 pages, and we cut it into 2,000 postcards, and we gave the post office all 2,000 postcards at once, and by some miracle, all 2,000 postcards showed up on the same day in Manel's mailbox, but there wasn't enough room for all of them. Well, then some of them would fall on the floor, and they would disappear, and they would have to be retransmitted. So I might have an arrangement with Manel to say I won't send more than 100 postcards at a time until I hear back from you that you got them, and that way we won't overflow your mailbox. That's how TCP works, and that's basically how the internet works. Now there's some other little details. For example, in the network, we have labels on the various computers in the network, and we give them names. We call them domain names. The top level domain names are .edu and .com, and I'm sure everyone in this room has seen those labels on the net. What's important is that the domain names are for human consumption, but the network doesn't know what they mean. The network doesn't know where www.wcom.com is. It has no idea. It has to look that up in a directory. So, for example, www.wcom.com is a domain name. .com is the top level commercial domain, but it has to be translated into this other number, 208.234.102.119. It's an internet address before the internet knows how to send the packet through the net. So the internet itself uses addresses, not names, and we have a whole elaborate system called the domain name system to translate names into addresses, just like the telephone directory would be used to look up a person's name to find the telephone number to call that person. Well, there's another little problem, and one which we will return to later today, and that is the question of trademarks and domain names, because as the internet has become a commercial activity, we're finding that more and more trademarks are showing up in domain names, and worse, some domain names are being registered as trademarks. Trademark law does not require that a trademark be unique. It does not require that a trademark be owned by only one organization. There can be many companies that own the same trademark. In the United States, for example, there are two companies that have the trademark MCI. One of them is my company. It's a telecommunications company. But there's another one in another state in the United States that makes buses, big auto buses, and it's called MCI also. And it's all right under trademark law for the two companies to have the same name, because people who are interested in telecommunications are not looking for buses, and people who are looking for buses are not looking for telecommunications, so the two things are not confused. So trademark law allows ambiguity. The internet domain name system does not allow ambiguity. Every internet domain name must be unique. So here you have a fundamental conflict between the concepts of trademark law and ambiguity and the requirement of the internet domain name system for absolute uniqueness. It's just like 800 numbers, or what you might call free phone numbers, or maybe here is 900 numbers. Those have to be unique. You wouldn't want two people with the same number, because then you get confused. Internet domain names are just like that. So now we're in the middle of an internet gold rush. You know, in gold rushes, people are rushing around looking for gold. But we've learned some lessons from other gold rushes in the past. And one of the lessons that we've learned is that the people who make money in the gold rush are not necessarily the people that are looking for the gold. The people that make money in the gold rush are the ones selling picks and shovels to the other people looking for the gold. And yes, that's how MCI WorldCom is making money out of selling the electronic equivalent of picks and shovels to other people who are looking for gold, and it's a very good business. We don't have any complaint about this. Some people are looking for gold in the net, or really they're looking for gold in the stock market. There's a very peculiar business model, which I don't think is going to last very long, but had quite a rapid evolution. This business model said that you started a company, and you ran the company for about 1 year, and then you opened up the company to public ownership by having an initial public offering of stock. The stock would become extremely valuable, and then you take the value of the stock and you go and buy something that's worth something, so that you could justify the value of the stock. Now, that's an interesting business model, but in fact, we're now finding that the analysts in Wall Street are asking very good questions about internet companies. For example, they're saying, I think it would be a good idea if you made more money than you spend. But the fact is that the internet as a commercial enterprise is still pretty young. The first time that anyone was allowed to do anything commercial on the internet was in 1990, or 1989. So that was just 10 years ago. And as a result, there is still a lot of people experimenting with business models on the network. And there are many, many trials are being held to see what kind of business models work. So you shouldn't be surprised if there are lots of people with business models that don't seem to make much sense. There will be a lot of experiments, and the notion of a reliable business model on the internet will probably not emerge for several years yet. I thought it might be useful to spend a little time on how big is the network and how fast is it growing. So just to give you some sense of growth for the last 2.5 years, these are some statistics from the middle of 1997 to today. In the middle of 97, there were about 1.3 level 2 domain names registered in .com. Level 2 just means there were two symbols, like wcom.com is a level 2 domain name. And there were 1.3 million of those registered in the middle of 97. There are over 12 million of them now registered in .com in April of this year. 2.5 years ago, there were an estimated 22.5 million computers on the net, and I don't include things like this laptop on the stage. I mean servers, web servers, email servers, and so on. 22.5 million of those. There are now 72 million. At the beginning of this year, I would estimate at least 100 million as of May of this year. The number of countries that had access to the internet was about 190 2.5 years ago. Now there are 218 countries or territories that are on the net. As you'll see, though, the network is not uniformly penetrated. It is more intensely available in some countries and less intensely available in others. So this is not a uniform penetration. The number of users in the net was about 50 million 2.5 years ago. Now it's 276 million in February. I would estimate about 300 million now in May. But to put this in perspective, there are 950 million terminations on the telephone system. So internet is still very small compared to the telephone network. But the telephone network tends to grow at 5 to 10% per year, not counting mobiles, which tends to grow at about 35 or 40% per year. Internet has been growing at 80 to 100% per year since 1988, and it continues to grow at that pace. Now here's an interesting statistic that I only learned yesterday. That in .es there are 18,000 domain name registrations, and in .com there are 200,000 registrations that appear to be of Spanish origin. This statistic, by the way, is very similar to something we see in the United States. There are very few registrations in .us and a great many registrations in .com. What this suggests to me, in part, is that many companies want to appear to be global in their operation and don't particularly want to be associated with any particular country or location. And so .com has become a very, very popular place to register. Yes, good point. Amadeo points out there were some local restrictions in .es that might make it hard for someone to have made a registration in that domain name. Perhaps we can come back to that during our discussion time. In terms of the locations where Internet is in use, these statistics I found quite interesting. Less than half of the Internet users are in North America. 5 years ago, this would have looked quite different, and most of the users would be in Canada or the United States. But now less than half of them are in the US and Canada. 72 million of the users of the 275 million are in Europe. Now that's interesting because the European population of Internet users was about 54 million 6 months ago. So you've added almost 50% in the last 6 months. In Asia and the Pacific Rim, there are 55 million users. 6 months ago, that was about 35 million. The absolute number is a little disappointing because the population in the Pacific Rim is well over 2 billion. You have Asia, you have Japan, China, India, Indonesia, and Malaysia, just to name some of the more populous countries. So 55 million out of 2 billion is a pretty small number. But there are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is Internet got started later in the Pacific Rim than it did elsewhere. But also the telecommunications infrastructure in some of those countries is still fairly weak, in India, for example, and in China. Latin America is starting to wake up. 6 months ago there were about 6 million users, now there are almost 8.8 million. In Africa, the population on the Internet has doubled in the last 6 months, but still 2.5 million is a very small number. There are almost 1 billion people in Africa. So clearly 2.5 million is small. Most of those 2.5 million people are in South Africa, or in Egypt, or in Morocco, or Tunisia. The rest of them are in small numbers in the other countries of Africa. Part of the reason that the African continent has such a small user base is, first of all, very weak telecommunications infrastructure in most of the countries, and second, there are weak economies. There's not a lot of money available, and that doesn't help sustain Internet. The Middle East had about 880,000 users 6 months ago. It now has 1.3 million. Most of those are in Israel, but the surrounding Arab states are beginning to pick up and use the Internet as well. Now, just to show you, though, that there are people who are determined to get on the net no matter what. Oh, I don't have the picture here. This is terrible. Let's see. Oh, I'm angry about that. Okay, we have to fix this. Is everybody willing to wait just a moment here while we go offline and you get to see hacking on the net? Let's see. Where were we yesterday? We can probably find this. Here we are, at the Barcelona Science Museum. This is a really important picture. We have to wait for Mr. Gates now to do his thing. Yes, before the judgment, that's right. Okay, here it comes. The problem is this is a very big file. It's a 14 megabyte PowerPoint file, and it takes a while to ingest it into the machine. I hope it doesn't get digestion. That's not good. Indigestion. Okay, here we go. Now let's see if I can find the, this is what I wanted. Here's a picture that I got from two people in in Africa. They were in Uganda, and they got a solar power converter, and a satellite antenna and a personal computer. And they used this little village didn't have any power, and it didn't have any telephone service, but they wanted to be on the net. So they used the solar power converter and the satellite antenna and this personal computer to get on the net, and then they took a digital picture of themselves on the roof, adjusting the antenna, and then they emailed this to me. So a few weeks ago, or actually a few months ago, I got this picture attached to an email saying, "We're up on the net." I don't want to leave you with the impression that I think, therefore, Africa is on the net, but it's important to see that if you're really determined to get on the net, you'll find a way to do it. And these guys did. Okay, let's go back now to, here we go. I think that this is where, yes, okay. Well, let's looking at user trends. My current estimate is that about half of the world's population will be on the net by the year 2010, by the end of this decade. Of course, we'll get to test this theory in about 10 years and see whether I was right. The other estimate that I've made in the past is that I think the number of devices on the net will be about 900 million by 2006. That's the yellow line here, in case it's not obvious. That includes not only things like desktops and laptops, but it includes other internet-enabled appliances. Well, I was pretty comfortable with that estimate, and that would make the internet about the same size as the telephone system in about 6 years' time. However, then I went to talk to Nokia and LM Ericsson, and they told me that they expected to have almost 1.5 billion, 1.5 billion internet-enabled mobiles on the internet by that same time. And so now it looks as if there might be 2.5 billion devices on the internet by 2006. Now this started to really scare me a little bit, because remember we said that the address space in the net could contain up to 4 billion addresses. Well, 2.5 billion still leaves about 1.5 billion addresses unused, but we're not very good about allocating the address space. It's not perfect. And in fact, there's a lot of wasted space. So by 2006, I think we will be under very, very great pressure to have a new address space which is bigger. And I want to come back to that in a little bit. Well, let me switch gears now and tell you about some technology which is creating policy problems. We're being asked today to carry video and telephony and radio on the internet. Now, it's not new to carry sound on the net. In fact, even as far back as 1975, I was doing experiments to carry voice over the internet. But in those days, the speed of the backbone was 50,000 bits per second. That was the backbone of the network. That's slower than what you can get with a dial-up telephone line today. But that's all the capacity we had. So in order to carry sound on the net, voice on the net, we had to compress that voice signal. We digitized it and then compressed it. And we got it compressed down to 1,800 bits per second using some special techniques. There was only one little problem. Anyone who spoke through that compression system came out sounding like a drunken Norwegian. And so the day came when I had to demonstrate this to some generals in the Pentagon. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to do this. And then I remembered that one of the researchers that was working on voice on the net worked for the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. So we asked him to be the speaker, and it sounded just like him. So we didn't tell the generals that everyone would sound that way. Now, it's gotten a lot better in the last 25 years because we have more capacity on the net and we can transmit very good quality sound. So today, there are about 8,000 radio stations that transmit their sound on the net. And some of them don't even bother transmitting anything over the air. They just use the internet to deliver their sound. But this raises an interesting business problem. If you think about an ordinary radio, a radio station, You define radio audience by the power of the transmitter, how much power does it have, and how far away is the receiver. And that gives you a geographic definition of the audience for that radio. But on the internet, you could be anywhere in the world, and you could still hear this sound. So now the definition of your market is not geographically defined anymore. It's got to be something else. Video is very similar to radio on the net, except that it takes about 400 kilobits per second to deliver good quality video on the network with full screen and 25 or 30 frames per second. There's a problem there because 400 kilobits per second is faster than you can get with a dial-up line. In fact, it's about 8 times faster. So in order to have good quality video delivered through the internet, we need higher speed access lines than we can get with the telephone network. There are some new technologies available. Some of them are called digital subscriber loops, cable modems, and even point-to-point radio links, all of them operating at millions of bits per second. But we won't have access to those alternative technologies unless the telephone companies and the cable companies actually install and make available that kind of facility. We're seeing an increasing amount of this in the United States. I don't know how active the telephone companies are here in rolling out some of these technologies. Not very much. Okay, I see advertisements for DSL, but
it's too sharp topic.
Okay, we'll come back to that. There are some issues there having to do with competition and things like that. Anyway, so you can deliver video through the net, and some people still try to watch video even at lower data rates than 400 kilobits per second. And what you get is a little 2-inch screen and maybe 6 or 7 frames per second. Every time I do that, I expect to see a caption come up on the bottom of my screen saying, "Congratulations, you turned your $5,000 laptop into a 1928 television set." Telephony is actually harder to do on the net than radio and television. And the reason doesn't have to do with bandwidth or with capacity, it has to do with delay. When you talk to someone through the internet, remember the bucket brigade? The store and forward nature of the net means there's quite a bit of delay between the time that you send something and the time that it gets to the other side and a response comes back. If you ever talk to someone over a satellite loop or a satellite link, you know what I mean, because there's about a half a second of delay. I know if I had to talk to Manel on the phone and through the internet and there's a half second of delay, I might say, "Manel, what do you think of that idea?" And now I can't possibly hear an answer for at least 1 second, and that's even if he doesn't think about it. But that 1/2 second feels like a long time. And all I can think of is that Manel thinks my idea is really stupid, but he's trying to figure out a nice way to tell me that. So there's a social effect that delay introduces in telephone conversations. So the internet has to be re-engineered so that it treats some packets with higher priority than others. And that's what's going on today, that we're redesigning the inside of the internet so that some of the traffic can be delivered faster to the other end than, for example, email or file transfers. Well, I just want to mention one other thing. What we're seeing now is that the traditional media, television and radio and telephone, are showing up on the internet. So internet is carrying those media. The other thing is happening as well. The traditional media like cable, direct broadcast, satellite, radio, and so on are capable of carrying internet packets. And so we're finding that internet is invading in both directions. It's being carried through the older media and it is carrying the older media. So the two are not so much colliding as they are commingling together. That's causing great regulatory confusion, because in the past, regulators could distinguish between a television broadcaster, a cable caster, a radio company, and a telephone company. But as everything is carried on top of internet, then it's being carried in a uniform way, and it's no longer clear whether you should regulate these separately or not. Now, you remember the statistics that said there would be 900 million devices on the net, not counting the mobiles? Here's one of the reasons I think that's going to happen. 2 graduate students at the University of Massachusetts built a 2-chip web server had two computer chips. One chip did the TCP/IP protocols, because it was this one, and the other chip did the file, delivered the files that a web server typically puts up on your screen, the HTML files. So that whole web server was about the size of a couple of American quarters. I would estimate those to be like two 1,000 peseta pieces. So it's a pretty small device. And in fact, because it's so small and because it's hardware, the cost for making something internet enabled is going to come down to a very small number. That means that every graduate student is going to try to make all kinds of devices internet enabled, including your mixer and toaster and that thing. What is that thing? What is that thing that you... It's a mixer?
It is.
It looks like a cattle prod.
It's not internet savvy, that's a mixer.
Oh, okay. Oh, but it doesn't know how to do internet packets. All right, well, we'll fix that with this little device. Okay. So already there are people announcing internet-enabled refrigerators. Now, if your family is like my family, the communication center is in the kitchen, and it consists of paper and magnets. And we put the paper on the refrigerator door and hold it on there with magnets. So the internet-enabled refrigerator is an improvement because now it has a big liquid crystal display, and you can put up email and the web, and that way you have a better communication center. We'll come back to the internet-enabled refrigerator with some other ideas in a minute. Here's another one. It's an internet-enabled picture frame that was demonstrated at a consumer electronics show. And I have to admit to you that the first time I saw this, all I could think of was that this looked about as useful as an electric fork. And you know, it was useful for stabbing yourself in the tongue. It turns out, though, this is quite clever because it just plugs into the wall and into the telephone system, and it automatically makes a call to the net, and it downloads images from a web server that's predetermined. So this is starting to get attractive. You don't have to program it. You don't have to boot it up. It just runs, like the little electrical motors that keep your ice cream cold. So if you're a grandparent, for example, and you don't want to learn about the internet, but you want to see what's happening to the grandchildren, you get one of these and you plug it into the wall, and if the parents will put pictures of the grandchildren on the web server, this little picture frame will simply pull the images every morning, and the grandparents can watch the little grandchildren growing up. And they never have to learn how to program anything or learn what it means to click on a mouse or anything like that. So this may turn out to be an important example of internet-enabled devices that just do a few things, not too many things, and not like a personal computer, which is too confusing. Okay. I expect to see a lot more internet-enabled devices on the internet. Some you've probably heard about. Web TV is an example of something which is an internet-enabled television set that shows ordinary television and does email and allows you to search the web. There are Palm Pilots or other personal digital assistants that are internet-enabled. There's a Nokia 9000, which is a cell phone, a mobile phone, a pager, and also an email device. In fact, Manuel, can I borrow yours again? Some of you, I'm sure, have seen these. This is the Nokia 9000 series, opens up, has a little liquid crystal display, and a tiny little keyboard that's suitable for people who are 3 inches tall. I visited Sony, Nintendo, and Sega when I was in Japan not too long ago, and they are making internet-enabled video games. So I got to thinking about the way children play with the video games and what it would mean if they were internet-enabled. Well, when they're playing together in the same room, they can hear each other and see each other, and that makes it more fun because you can hear your friends screaming and yelling. On the other hand, if you're at home and you're separate from each other and you can't see each other or hear each other, you can just play this group video game. So it wouldn't take much to put a microphone on the video game so you could pick up sound and transmit it to the other players. And in fact, there's one company that did that, and they discovered that the children who were able to talk to each other while they were playing the game were more effective in these games than the ones who had to stop and type at each other. because you could move and talk at the same time. The military discovered that was pretty important a long time ago, and that's why they had radios so you could move and to coordinate at the same time. Now, some of those games involve airplanes, shooting at each other, and if you shoot somebody down, it would be kind of fun to see the expression on their face while they're heading straight down. So you want a television camera that could get the picture of the person who's playing the game as they're heading straight for the dirt. It wouldn't take much to put a television camera on the video game, because when you're playing the game, you have to stay in front of the television set anyway, so you don't move around too much, or you don't move out of the field of view. So I got to thinking, this is really interesting. If you put in a microphone and a camera on the video game, you now have a collection of people that are physically separated from each other, but they can hear each other and see each other, and they can shoot at each other. And that sounded like a good video conference. So now my prediction is that the business world is going to adopt video conferencing through the use of video game technology, because the video games are very inexpensive. They're $300 or something, compared to the very elaborate and expensive video conferencing systems that are being sold in industry today. So in the future, I expect to see video games showing up in the businesses to support video conferencing. And the nice benefit of that is that if the video conference gets too boring, you can always go back to playing the video game. Of course, if you put a bottle of milk in the refrigerator, the refrigerator may know what it is, but it might not know how much milk is left. But it at least knows how long it's been in there. So you might get an email from your refrigerator saying, if you don't do something about it, your milk is going to crawl out of the refrigerator on its own because it's been there for 3 weeks. When I was in Japan, they showed me a bathroom scale that you could step on, and it was internet-enabled bathroom scale. When you step on the bathroom scale, your weight gets sent to the doctor. It becomes part of your medical record. But then somebody asked, well, what happens if the refrigerator gets the same information? Then it doesn't open anymore. I had a chance to drive an internet-enabled car. It was a Mercedes-Benz. In the back seat, they had 2 liquid crystal displays for the children to play games or to get surf on the net. There was a display for the driver. The car had a global positioning satellite receiver, so the car knew where it is. It knows where it is. That means the computer that's in the car knows where the car is. And that means that you could have programs in the computer that can reach out into the internet and get useful information back from databases that are geographically indexed. So you can ask questions like, where's the nearest restaurant? Where's the nearest hospital? Can I make a reservation? Can you show me directions for getting to where I want to go? Those are all very reasonable questions to ask if the car knows where it is and is on the internet. There are some other examples, but I don't feel like I have time to go into them, except for the last one I have to tell you about. I travel a great deal, and for many years I was comfortable doing my email while I was in the airplane, even if I had people sitting next to me, because the display was so bad that they couldn't read it, even if they were sitting next to me. Of course, now the displays are very, very good, and the guy who's 5 seats back can read my email just as well as I can. So I got to, sorry? Except for you, except for Amity, that's right. Yes. So you're no threat to my privacy. I appreciate it. Well, I did get to thinking, how could I protect my privacy while I'm reading my email? And I got the idea that we could have special glasses that project an image onto your retina directly. Now, there are people experimenting with that at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But then I got to wondering what it would be like to sit next to someone on a plane who's using these reading glasses to interact with a virtual image, which he can see, but you can't. Well, the first problem is, how do you point to anything in that virtual image? One way to do it would be to have something like a thimble that goes on your finger and can be located in 3 dimensions. So now imagine that you're sitting next to this person, and this person is pointing to places in the image. but of course, he's just waving his hands in the air because you can't see anything. And my reaction would be to ask the attendant, could I please move somewhere else? I don't know what this person is doing. Okay, now I have to say, first, the top of this slide says wires. Where we're going, we won't need wires. For those of you who remember movies, there was something called Back to the Future. And one of the movies, the first one at the very end, this Doc Brown shows up. And the last line that he utters is, roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads. And then the wheels fold up and the car rises up and they take off in the air. Well, we don't need wires anymore to be on the net. There is an enormous initiative to put all kinds of devices on the net through wireless. And of course, some of you, like Manel, are carrying wireless devices like the Nokia 9000 that are capable of interacting with the net, sending and receiving email, and even surfing the net through the web. So there's a great deal of development now in wireless communication, not only radio but also infrared. The cell phones are going through a rapid evolution now from the current GSM designs, which only give you about 9.6 kilobits per second. That's enough to do email, but it's not very comfortable surfing the web. The General Packet Radio Service, or GPRS, has a higher bandwidth possibility, up to about 100 kilobits per second. And the third generation of cell phones may be able to work at 2 million bits per second. Now that's enough to do some pretty serious work on the net. When I went to Geneva in October of last year, I saw many wireless devices, but one really caught my attention. It was a camera, digital camera, with a radio that connected it to the internet. So when you took a picture with the digital camera, it transmitted the picture to a website. Well, of course, that website could be the one that the little internet-enabled picture frame goes to pull up images. So now it's easy to keep track of the kids for the grandparents. You just take pictures with your radio-based camera, and the images go to the website and then off to the picture frame. The next line of this slide is filled with letters. They all represent different kinds of radio communications technology. Digital broadcast satellite, multimedia distribution systems are alternatives to physical cable television. Ricochet is the name of a radio service in the US. All of these have the potential to operate at hundreds of thousands of bits per second to millions of bits per second, which means that they can be part of the internet-enabled video. Bluetooth, I guess I should mention. Bluetooth is not a dental condition. It's the name of a technology for low-power radio, so that devices that are a few feet apart can communicate with each other instead of having to have wires everywhere. So it's a kind of desktop communications network. The Bluetooth radios are pretty small, and some people have suggested we could put them in our cufflinks. And this way, the left hand and the right hand could find out what each one is doing, because often your left and right hand don't know what's going on. So this is just a way of technology helping people coordinate. It does have a side effect, though, to be up on the net by radio, because when you're on the net by that means, you're literally always on. You have to be ready at any moment to send a packet or receive one, which means you have to have an address. So this means the address space is being consumed even more quickly because of the use of radio. And that's forcing us to look at alternative address structures than the 32 bits that we have today. And in fact, that brings me to the version 6 protocol. Now, if you've been paying attention, by the way, you'll notice that the 32-bit protocol that we've been talking about is version 4. The new version that I'm talking about is version 6. It has 128 bits of address space. You might ask, what happened to version 5? The answer is, it was an experiment that didn't work, and so we put it to bed and we went on to version 6. 128 bits is enough to have 10 to the 38th devices. That's a 1 with 38 zeros after it. I don't know what you call that number. All I know it's a big number. In fact, I thought it was big enough So every electron in the universe could have its own web page. Except I just found out from the guys at Caltech that I was wrong. I was told there are 10 to the 88th electrons in the universe. And so this address space was too small by 50 orders of magnitude. That's a pretty big mistake. But 10 to the 38th is still a pretty big number. So we did a different calculation. We said, where do people live? Well, they live on 30% of the surface of the planet. And we have a habitat that's about 1 kilometer high. So if you take that human habitat on the planet and you divide it by 10 to the 38th, the volume that that represents is about 46,000 molecules. So you know the people who are making, you know the word nanotechnology or nano engines? Well, if the guys who are making those little nano machines don't make them smaller than 46,000 molecules, we'll have enough addresses so every single nano engine can have its own address. And that's, I think, enough address space until I'm dead, and after that I don't care, it's somebody else's problem. So let me just summarize where we are in the 21st century. The Internet protocol will literally be everywhere as this century unfolds. We'll have what's called IP dial tone, which is the Internet equivalent of telephone dial tone, and a lot of it will be wireless. Second, we'll be putting everything on top of the Internet protocol, television, radio, telephony, the print media. It doesn't mean that the older media go away. It just means that they will be augmented by carriage through the Internet. I think there's going to be an increasing emphasis on value-added services in the net because the basic packet services will become a commodity, if they have not already become so. There will be a lot of business-to-business applications, B2B, because that's where the money is right now, is supporting business applications. And finally, there's going to be a very intense international competition, and in one dimension at least, and that's in the labor markets. The best way I can illustrate that is to tell you about an email I got a few months ago. The email offered to make web pages from Microsoft Word or text files or PowerPoint files. And the person who sent the email said, I will make 10 pages for $125 US, which is actually a very good price for making web pages. And he also went on in his email to say if I didn't have a web server to put the information up, that he would rent me a web space for $250 a year. I'm sorry, I didn't translate this into pesetas, but maybe you can do that. Sorry? Euros, but yes, the euros are close. So those numbers are actually pretty low compared to what we often have to pay in the United States. The email came from someone in Bangalore, India. And what he had figured out is that he had a lot of very well-trained people who had learned Internet at the Indian Institutes of Technology, and their pay scales were quite a bit lower than in the United States. So he could compete by selling services from those very well-trained engineers in markets outside of India. Well, I think we're going to see more exporting of labor through the network. People don't have to leave the country in order to do useful work. And, moreover, they can do work even if the country they're living in has only a limited amount of Internet capability. They just need the ability to reach to the rest of the world where Internet has already penetrated. And I think we'll see an increasing amount of competition in exactly that way as time goes on. Well, that brings us finally to the most important part of our talk, because although everything I've been discussing is interesting from the technology point of view, there are many, many policy issues that the Internet is raising, and those are the ones that deserve attention. In order to preserve privacy on the net, we need cryptography. And there are some big issues having to do with cryptographic export. In the United States, we weren't permitted to export cryptography until very recently. Now it's possible to export fairly high-quality crypto, and that's important not only for protecting personal privacy, but also business transactions. Trademarks and copyright are big issues too, especially copyright. Some of you came in earlier before we started today, and you might have heard some music coming out of this computer. That sound was based on MP3 digitized sound that I downloaded on the net. And I actually don't know whether any of the things I copied were actually copyrighted and protected in theory. If they were protected, then I violated the law by making copies of them to put on my machine without paying anybody. So that's a big issue in the digital world. There are open questions about regulation in the internet environment, and it's made more complicated by all the various media showing up within this common system. When we carry out transactions on the internet, buying and selling, if there's a dispute over the transaction, no one is quite clear about where that dispute should be resolved. Where did the transaction take place in cyberspace? Well, nobody knows. And so we're going to have to come up with some artificial decisions about where those jurisdictions lie. Taxation has become a very, very noisy topic in the United States with respect to the internet. Some people think nothing on the net should be taxed. Other people are saying that every transaction on the net should carry a tax. The business world is saying that there shouldn't be a disparity between buying a book on the net and buying a book in a bookstore. The two should have equal taxes, regardless of whether the book is delivered electronically or not. I happen to favor that view, frankly, because I don't think that there should be an artificial difference between buying and selling essentially the same thing in these different media. But that's something that could be debated. Censorship is a big issue. There are some parts of the world that want to limit the content that is put on the net. But this raises some technological questions about what happens if you try to do that. It hasn't been very effective in any country that I know of. And finally, when we carry out exchanges on the net or transactions, somehow we need to have the equivalent of a wet signature that you would do with a pen, but in the digital form. And there are technologies for supporting that. They're called digital signatures. The problem is that we don't have what's called a public key infrastructure for implementing digital signatures on a global scale. Part of the challenge associated with policy issues on the internet is that the policies have to be implemented not simply on a national scale, but on an international scale in order to be effective. And that raises a great many questions about how that international agreement is made, how laws are constructed that will implement things uniformly around the world, or at least compatibly. There are all kinds of intellectual property issues that come up, and I've touched on a few of them already. When you download software from the net, whose software is it? Does anybody own it? Do you owe anything if you run it? What happens if there's something that you download the software and it causes damage on your machine? Who do you blame for that? Can you sue someone? No one knows the answer to those questions. What about web content? Is it public domain? Is there any protection for the content that you look at on the net? What happens if you point to someplace else on the net? Are you violating anyone's copyright privileges by pointing to something that's in the system? Those are all problems that haven't been thoroughly resolved. We talked about trademarks and domain names and the fundamental conflict between the two. Here's another example of a very confusing question. If someone writes a piece of software that allows you to create web pages, and you use it to create some web pages and you draw on content from the other part of the net, there's this question of who owns rights in the resulting work. And it's not clear, first of all, who owned the rights to the material that you may have taken from the net, but worse, if you used some complicated tool to create a web page on the fly from databases that are scattered around the net, does the person who created the software tool own any of the rights to what you produced or not? That's like saying if you use Microsoft Word, does Microsoft own any of the results of your composition? Today we don't consider that the tool maker has any rights in the work that you do, but when the tool is commingled with information that's on the net and then produces a result, the resulting work is a very uncertain ownership, and those are areas that need to be attended to. One of the most complicated cases is music. It's possible to encode music in digital form, and the object that has that encoding can be interpreted in a number of different ways. It could be interpreted as sheet music. You could print it out. You could play it. You could interpret it as sound. Or you could even use that digital description of the music to drive something else, like a light display. Well, those are three different ways of interpreting the same object. And in the past, the way we protected things is to be very careful about the kind of medium in which we fixed the interpretation. And now we have the same object that can be viewed several different ways. It's not clear what rules we should use to protect the intellectual property. Now that is all of the formal remarks that I'm going to make this morning. There's more than this morning here. And so what I'd like to do is to begin to invite some discussion and debate. If you're interested in using these slides, by the way, you're more than welcome to them. There are no protections on them. If you do use them, you can take them from the Surf's Up website at www.wcom.com/surfsup. I would just appreciate it if you do use them, if you give credit to where you got them. But apart from that, they're quite open and available to you. So let me thank you for taking this much time for these remarks, and turn this over, I guess, to Amadeo to organize the rest of the discussion.